All bears might look like bears, just as all people look like people. Yet bears differ greatly in appearance. Their facial characteristics, especially, are individually identifiable and may even contain features that tell a story about their lives. By taking a closer look, we might better appreciate those stories. And one way to do that is to put pencil to paper and concentrate on the uniqueness of a single bear. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Fitz. I'm the resident naturalist with Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. This is episode 2 of Drawn to Explore, a program through which we hope you'll be inspired to take your creativity and love for wildlife in different directions. And to help us explore that further, I'm joined by my co-host, Sarah Woolman. Sarah moonlights for Explore.org on graphic design and social media projects. Sarah, thanks for coming back and for episode 2. I think this will be a fun one.
Yeah, I'm excited. So today we are going to be working with drawing portraits of bears, really kind of diving into like what makes a bear's personality, how do we bring that to life on paper. And we're going to be doing the notorious chunk today. So that'll be really fun. So we're going to be starting with an eye demonstration first. And then we're going to go into the actual portrait itself, and I'm going to teach you the building blocks of how to make a bear look like a bear, which is really important because as Fat Bear Week comes up, I know we're all going to be campaigning, and we're all going to want to know how to bring out those characteristics of the bears that we love the most.
Absolutely. And our efforts this week build on some of the skills that we practiced last time. So if you have comments and questions for Sarah and I about this process, especially Sarah, I wouldn't consider myself that great of an artist. I can only
Not true.
share people's frustrations, I think, when you're sketching. But anyway, yeah, if you have questions about the process, Sarah's techniques, for example, so maybe you're looking for some tips, drop those in the chats. We'll be looking for them during the broadcast today. And Sarah, let's we talked about how we're gonna build on some of the skills that we practiced last time, but so maybe we can recap just briefly what we did in our last episode.
Definitely. So last episode, we did an awesome profile drawing of Otis. And that was really just to kind of give us the basics, the groundwork, because each episode that we're working on is kind of going to give us a little bit more, add something to our toolbox here. So we were working on proportions, how light affects shading, and just like getting comfortable with our tools that we're using here. Because again, it's about observing and enhancing our experience in nature and how we're putting that on paper. So again, we're not looking at a finished product here. We're just looking at something that's easing our way into doing more and more of these and our comfortability level. And so that's what we did last week. It was just a really simple pen and paper, some pencil, and that was our profile. And this week we're going to kind of add on to that by looking a little bit more at specific characteristics to make a bear.
And we had some great viewer participation from the last episode. So maybe we can take a moment to look and share what some of those submissions looked like. I think everyone did a wonderful job. Sarah, which did you have any that stood out to you or you wanted to comment on?
Well, I wanted to say in general, I was just really impressed with everyone's enthusiasm to jump right in. I know that's not an easy thing to do. It can be intimidating. And I was just so happy to see so many people enjoy this and just take the leap and jump in and do it. My favorite thing about seeing a lot of different people's things up next to each other is the different styles everyone has. I think it's awesome. We're all looking at the very same thing and perceiving it so differently in our own way. And that's the most important and special thing about art and observing and looking at nature is that we are creating our own very own experience, which is very evident in these pictures that we see here. So we have everything from Otis just right in the standard position he was in to ones where he's moving around a little bit. We got one that added some color here. I was just really happy, and I'm so glad that everyone's enjoying this.
Yes, I agree completely. And it takes courage, I think, to put that stuff on the internet as well, because the internet can be a terrible place. We all know that.
Oh yeah.
Um, People, you just often don't behave very civilized over the internet. So yeah, so thanks everybody who did that and shared their sketches with everyone. If you want to, participate along with us and you want to share your sketch with others, you can use the hashtags drawn to explore and hashtag draw bear cams. So, or you can send your submissions directly to feedback@explore.org with the subject line drawn to explore. So we can maybe perhaps share them in the next episode. But this one, Sarah, we are going to focus again on the details of maybe like an individual bear's face, but maybe
Mhm.
we can bring in the bear cams for just a moment. We can talk a little bit about how that can perhaps inspire us to get started in this process.
Definitely. And so when I'm doing specific illustrations, like for example, if I have to do like an interpretive sign or something, I have to sometimes think about like the behaviors that they're doing. And so what does a bear look like when it's doing a specific behavior? Like what are the facial features that it has? And I've had to stare at so many pictures of very specific things to do that. And it does you start to recognize it and you really understand like their expression. It's the same way as if we were to look at a dog. We know our dogs so well. We know their expressions. And, I spend a lot of time looking at these bears, as most of us have, I'd imagine. And they do really start to have their own expression. So you can get the very small differences in a portrait that really brings forth like what the bear might be doing, might be thinking, all of that. I know we can't really see too much up close right now, but when we have the opportunity to, you can really see it on their faces. And so it's not necessarily about like emotion, because that's always a very controversial thing when we're talking about animals, even though we all have opinions about that. However, they do have very specific characteristics in their face that will change in a certain way depending on what's happening in their situation. I know what your thoughts are on that, Mike.
Yeah, well, I was just looking at the webcam footage here, and of course, right before we started the program, there were loads of bears on on the Riverwatch camera, and of course, right now there's none. I think this camera will be a good one to pay attention to later in the season, as well as like our Brooks Falls cameras, um, because we'll get like these really great close-ups of bears as they're sitting very calmly, maybe at the waterfall or at downriver in the lower river area where there's just kind of scavenging on salmon. But yeah, the thing that really, seeing bears in person helped me understand that they all look very, very different. But also when I was editing like the very first versions of Katmai National Park's Bears of Brooks River ID book, I would go through all of these profile pictures from the park staff had taken, and you just see this tremendous variety of facial characteristics and features. And yeah, they do have, I think, kind of like different moods that can be captured in those. We're ascribing our own meanings to the bears through that. We don't know what's going on in the bear's head, for example, but some bears, some bears seem to have like a happy-go-lucky sort of persona to them. Others are much more serious in their disposition. So as we head along, yeah, and you're watching the bear cams, you may want to pay attention to the facial characteristics of the bears, maybe the color of their fur, the slope and shape of their muzzle. It's very different, and the position of their ears, and scars and shed patches too. Those are going to be very important as well. And then, yeah, Sarah, the angle of the light, of course, and the mood of the scene you're capturing on paper really plays an important role in how you might approach a sketch. So, I think we kind of have flat light right now, maybe similar to the first episode where we brought in
Very
live
similar.
cam footage. Yeah,
Mhm.
there's not a lot of sunlight happening to give it shadow or anything like that. But when you're looking at a specific animal's face, what's really the feature that you look to give it life and mood?
Sure. So for me, and I think it varies from person to person, but for me, I find a lot comes out in the eyes. Um, and drawing bear eyes are interesting because they're not like a lot of other animals' eyes that can be like really in your face. They kind of like they're smaller. They're very similar in color and stuff. So you really have to like look at it specifically and see where the light is and like see where they're moving and stuff. And Mike, I think we were talking the other day too, is that you barely even see the whites of a bear's eye unless it's like really looking one direction or the other. So there's a lot of very subtle things that go into it to kind of give the image life. But I would say eyes in general for any sort of creature, animal that I'm drawing is the go-to thing, I think, that really brings the personality, if you will, into it. And then obviously, like, one of the reasons why I chose Chunk for this specifically is because he's got a really big facial scar on his muzzle there. So that is it's an easy way for us to be like, okay, we can dive in and make this really look like Chunk because of that. So it's helpful to have something like that to go off of to begin with, and then you can start to understand things like the eyes and why that gives it life the way that it does. But that was my reasoning behind my choice today, and then we're going to go specifically into an eye demonstration too in a little bit.
Yeah, so maybe we can go ahead and get started with that, Sarah. So the eye sketch I'm looking forward to because it does really bring out life in an animal. Anytime I've ever tried to draw like a specific individual animal, if it's like a close up, and again, I've tried and failed, and that's just part of the process, right? But I try to do the eyes first. I don't want to do like the whole thing because I feel like if I do the whole thing and I screw up the eyes, then it's just going to look wrong. Uh,
Yeah, I
I don't
mean,
know if that's how you start. Uh,
I do that too so many times too, which is fun for like when I'm actually making these videos. You can see me erase so many times. I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to do this perfect the first time, and that's totally okay. Going back in and reworking stuff is part of the process. So, yeah, I feel you. Eyes really do bring it together, and it kind of they're a good like leading off point from this. And so to begin with today's drawing that we're going to do. Simple things again. We're doing pencil, eraser. In the last video, I kind of went through them a little bit more when you can reference that if you want to too. You don't need all of the crazy high level art stuff that I use. I mean, most of the time, especially when I'm in the field, I'm using just like a 2H 2B pencil. Really simple. But today, I'm using a few different pieces of graphite for this at different varying levels, mostly in the softer levels because I'm blending a little bit more. An eraser and a kneaded eraser, which is one that you can use and smush it down really small and get some of the real highlights in. And I will show you examples of that as we're working today. And I don't think I mentioned this the last time, but the paper that I've been using is called Bristol board paper. You can use, again, any sketchbook, any piece of paper that you want. I have transitioned to Bristol board because it's really smooth. I just like the way it feels. So just something, if you guys want to try that out in the future, go for it. If not, regular paper works just fine too. So yeah, we're going to be starting with the eye, kind of talking about texture, a lot about how light interacts with our eyes and like why that gives us a little bit more life when we're drawing.
yeah, that sounds great. Let's get into that then. Let's take a look at how you approach sketching an eyeball. So Sarah, do you want to walk
Sure.
us through?
Yeah, definitely. So kind of going back to the very beginning again, we're starting with shapes, really basic shapes here. And eyes again for bears are a little bit difficult because everything kind of gets lost a little bit. It looks like, oh, it's just like black and dark. It's actually not. And of course you have to like zoom in really close to kind of see that some of these in some of these photos. So it's not just like a black dot there. If you really want to kind of give it something special, you have to see the different variants of colors there. So what I did here was I drew the actual shape itself. Again, kind of plotting in like where are the big light spots on there. So a really good activity that I did when I was first learning how to just draw light and reflection on stuff is to just look at like a jar, like a clear glass jar, see where the shapes of the light are hitting it. You know, it looks like just like a reflection, but if you look a little closer, you can see that each reflection makes a shape, and you just draw that shape on there, which is what I kind of did right here with this, with the eye there. Like within the big circle there, there's a reflection shape right there at the bottom. And that's usually pretty key that you see in most eyes in drawings. It's actually a lot easier with human eyes. So if you ever wanted to just like practice eyes and the way that light refracts through it, your own eye, really good way to practice. So the way that light hits eyes, usually it goes through the top and through, kind of comes out through the bottom. That's where the reflection is. And so to give that eye a little bit of life to it, that's where the reflection really is important. So where the light comes in at the top, where you can see I kind of left that space, and then at the bottom is like going to be a little bit of a light in space down there too. And that's how you can tell the eye is alive. It's moving, it's reflecting light. And that's really important. And I would say it's probably the most important thing if you really want to get the eyes right is the reflection within the eyes. Um, with things like human eyes, like we have really amazing colors and lines and shapes in there. Bears didn't really have that as much. So I kind of just blended it out. As you can see here, a little bit amorphous blob shape there inside.
Hmm.
And I was trying to opt to not use my hands too much in this one, just to kind of show a little bit of a technique that you can blend with these pencils, depending on like their hardness, the strength in which you're pressing down or not. And then using like the really heavy graphite at the end to kind of bring out the contrast there. So you can kind of see I'm still just playing with it a bit more, bringing in some more shadows as I go in. Again, it's also really great to start light and then go dark, at least for me. Sometimes it's not people like to just go in dark, but I find it's easier if I make a mistake to start light, go in dark after. And then if I need to come back in and do like more highlights, that's where the eraser, like the kneaded eraser is really helpful. So I kind of did the whole shape of the eye there, putting in the reflections of like where the water line is. That's really helpful too, to kind of give it a little bit of depth in there. It's like, all right, that's what's making it a little bit more realistic, giving it a little bit of a personality there. And then I'm kind of just going in and working the texture around it, like the fur. And the fur around bear's eye is actually really interesting. There's really wild patterns the way it all like kind of flows together. We're going to talk about that a bit more too when we actually jump in and start working on Chunk today, because he had a lot of really awesome fur patterns as I was doing that. But yeah, I didn't want to go too much into that the fur patterns, and that's really easy to get carried away, especially when I'm in the zone trying that. So I had to stop myself. But a lot of their expressions come from like their eyebrows and stuff right there, and the way the fur kind of moves around that eye. So it's all kind of connected in there. But that's kind of our first step there. And again, this is being recorded. So if people wanted to go back and look at this and kind of stop in certain areas, by all means do that. And, I will also try and go through and answer any questions if anybody puts them in the comments when this is over too.
I wanted to ask you a follow-up question about sort
Yeah.
of like the blending that you did, because the last time our first episode, you did a lot of blending using I forget what these things are called.
Oh yeah. I just call them blenders.
Yeah, blenders. And you use
Yeah.
your fingers as well. And you mentioned that you opted not to do that with the eye sketch. So uh what maybe would be the advantage of doing it this way? It seems like you just had like a soft pencil and you just pressed really hard with that. What might be the advantage of doing it that way versus blending?
Well, it's certainly less messy.
Okay.
For me, I'm an odd one where I'm a right-handed person. However, I learned to write with a hook like a left-handed person would write. So I get things really messy sometimes because I'm just blobbing the paper as I'm working. But I'm a messy artist in general, so usually it kind of goes with it. If I'm trying to like really kind of lock it in and show the like, hey, this is the way to do it without your hands, and like kind of the more like traditional way to do this, I'll do it something like this. So not everyone wants to just get their hands like dirty the way mine are. And exactly as you noticed, I was using a very soft graphite pencil, which are just my favorite ones. I find them to just be really smooth. I can blend them really nicely. I don't always hyper focus on super fine detail. There are some people that are very photorealistic, which is awesome. And I love doing that too. My typical style is just like a little bit more impressionistic, a little bit hazier. So that's why I like really working with some of those softer leads. And that's what I was kind of showing here is that you don't even need to do that with some of these like these softer graphite pencils. They kind of just blend right into each other because they're so soft. You don't even need to do the extra edge there. You can if you want to. By all means, I'm experiment, figure it out, see what works for you and what you're comfortable with. And sometimes I do that just because I'm not liking the way this one technique is working. So I try something different. Yeah, I'm not necessarily an advantage or disadvantage. It's really about like what you're comfortable with and what you're trying to convey with your final piece and finding your style too, which is always an ongoing process.
It's also, again, having confidence in building those layers, like just starting with a simple circle and building from there. And I think that's maybe how we're going to approach the next section in our program here, because we're going to look at the portrait of a bear in more detail, but you just don't start. Well, it seems like, Sarah, your technique is not to start with the fine details. It's to get the general shape accurate, right? So maybe
Definitely.
we can head into looking at Chunk's face more broadly.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, we can start jumping right into that if we want to. So kind of going back to last week again, and here again, we're just showing you the pencils and stuff that I'm using here. My erasers, kneaded eraser again. That's going to be so great for our highlights. It really is. It really is awesome. And I'll tell you a little cheat way to deal with that later too, if if I remember. But yeah, again, going in, doing this, you're just kind of mapping out your shapes again. So we're going with like basic shapes. So if you're kind of looking at even the bears behind me right now, we have giant circles on a lot of these. So that's kind of how I go in with the shapes of the head here. It's one big circle here. And it takes me a minute sometimes. I got to look at it. I kind of feel it out. Like, where is the final piece going to sit on it? Because so many times I have started drawing something and it's like way over to the left or way over to the right. and I have to go back in and fix it. And that's where this is coming in. So with a portrait specifically with bears, I kind of chose an easier one that was a little bit more straight on. Aside from just doing our big shapes, we're also doing guidelines. We worked with guidelines like a little bit, I think, in our last one, but this is where it really comes into play, because this is where the perspective of where our snout is, where the direction of where we're looking is really going to be helpful. And I don't always use guidelines. I feel like the more and more you do portraits, you kind of just start to like know where things are, but that takes time. It takes practice. And where we're starting today is that we're going to go fairly directly with like a slight curve in the middle here. And you can see it's just a cross section. That's where I started. One of the most common mistakes that is made with portraits in general, it's not just bears, it's humans too, is that we want to put our eyes a lot higher up than they actually are. We're very used to, like, I think in general, just drawing our eyes like where our forehead technically is. So always keep in mind is that eyes are usually much further down on most animals that you draw. That will actually aid a lot into kind of bringing a more like realistic perspective to the things that you're drawing. So eyes for bears, they're really close to their snout, like their muzzle. And you'll see as I kind of progress here more with this drawing here, where I'm going to actually put them in. Right now, I'm still focusing on just the giant circles that mostly make up Chuck's head. It's really easy with bears to figure that out too, because they just have circular rolls that go back for days from their head. This is why bears, again, are one of the best ways to kind of get into a lot of wildlife drawing, because they are very round and robust, very shapely, if you will. I call them Rubenesque. Only like art nerds really understand that joke, but they're really easy to draw, and for that reason. So again, I'm kind of referencing back in this video to where I put my original kind of cross-section guideline, and that is helping me put where the muzzle is. And again, it's circles that I'm kind of just slowly connecting with other lines here. And I'm going in again and kind of seeing like, where are the ears? It's another thing that when I was first learning how to like draw bears, and specifically ears are very important in relation to where the rest of the face is. Because you put them too far back or too far forward, it just looks very weird. So between the eyes and the ears, for some reason, that really seems to be the giveaway. And it's interesting too, because I've noticed one of the ways that a lot of people use like the characteristics to identify bears is we're looking at their ears a lot. So think about the things that you use to identify a bear. And even when you're just looking at your favorite bears, like what is the first thing that you're looking at when you're looking at a bear to identify it, especially in their face? And that's usually the most important thing that you need to convey when you're drawing. And it's actually really going to help your IDs a lot. I know it helps mine in general for any animal that I'm drawing. even if I had no idea what it was beforehand, after spending a bunch of time really observing and looking at it and thinking about how am I going to bring this to life, I'm able to idea it so much better based off of those characteristics. So in that kind of quick video there, we just really put down the basics here. So we're putting the guidelines down, the circles, mapping out the shapes, and with those guidelines, it kind of tells us like where each facial structure or piece is in relation to another one. And that's the biggest part, is that you're going to see, like, as we start filling this in, oh, maybe I need to move this a little bit further to the left, further to the right, because we have reference points. So reference points are super, super important. How did that go for you, Mike?
It's going. You know,
Going.
again, this is yeah, one of the things that I don't do too much. But yeah, so try to hold it up, getting
Great.
something. Uh, you know, one of the things that I noticed, Sarah, is that you know, you're starting out with circles, but really it looks like you're sort of envisioning the bear's face as a sphere more than anything else, a sphere that's connected through one another. Is that maybe what's happening in your brain? You're basically starting out with a circle, but again, you're using those layers to build more dimension to it.
Exactly. So the shapes itself really are reference points, and then I build out from that, and that's where things like the sphere comes from. Is that I need these sort of overall arching shapes to kind of give us a visual guide, because again, it can be a little overwhelming and just look at a blank piece of paper and be like, where do I start? Where do things lie in reference to each other? And as soon as you just kind of have these like really basic marks, is when you can just start putting out like adjusting. So it was like I like to almost relate it to if you're playing with like clay or silly putty, you know, you're just constantly like kind of moving it a little bit more, except we're doing that on paper. And we're using these basic shapes, the circles, the guidelines to as our starting point, and then we're molding it around those. So yeah, as I am doing this, I start to see like where these shapes are coming out a bit more. And you can see looking at Chunk's face, towards the top of his head, even though, you know, if we were to look at it straight up, yeah, circular. But as you look a little bit closer, you kind of it stretches out a little bit more here and there. And that's where we're kind of slowly edging it out.
We did have an audience question about the anatomy of a bear's face. Somebody was wondering, is the muzzle actually all bone? And as I understand it, Sarah, and correct me if you know anything different, but you know, their muzzle is does it, their nose especially is like ours. Like there's hard bone that extends a long way out, but where their nostrils are and where that they can actually move their nose sort of like a dog a little bit from side to side, they have you know, just connective tissue in there, a little bit of muscle, a lot of cartilage. So yeah, that's kind of like soft tissue at the beginning, and that can give them, I think, some expressiveness, especially if you were ever to try to capture a bear when it's engaged with its nose, because it's not going to be like the same shape every time.
Agreed. And it's actually because of that, because it's just like so almost blobby the way they move it. I actually find it to be the most difficult thing to draw on a bear's face is the actual the nose and their lips sometimes too, because it is just uh, cartilage and muscle tissue and stuff in there. But it does it when you get it right, it really adds to it. I think it can really bring a lot of character into it too.
Yeah, their world is they. I mean, so much of their world is sensed through their sense of smell. So and yeah, when you can get it right, it's such an important part of their world. It's also the nose is also so dark. It's always like you take a photograph of it. It's I don't know. It seems like there's always like it's either like the camera doesn't capture the darkness of it very well or the light for it because you're adjusted maybe to a brighter object. So yeah, I can understand how it might be
Oh,
difficult
definitely.
to see those details.
Yeah, and they're not like really easy shapes to decipher too. So much of it comes down to like the contrast and like the really, really subtle lighting. And you'll see me work through that actually as we go into a little bit deeper into drawing Chuck's face today. But that's always the thing that I try to get right, because it's always the one that's like that looks a little bit off, because it's a difficult shape. It's very dark, like you said, and it moves a lot. Okay, so I think we have a pretty good basis of this drawing here, right, Mike? Do you have any other
Yeah, I think
questions?
so. one more question that I had for you before we move on. I can see how this technique might be applied to graphic design. Your screen background actually showcases a little bit of that. So this is something that you use when you're using art software on a computer?
Oh yeah, and it depends on the project. A lot of times when I'm illustrating on the computer, I am just freehanding it. However, if I'm doing things that are more symmetrical, like a logo, or that's just what the project requires, I'm using like a straight up grid with measurements and rulers and everything, and it's very convenient because it's just on my computer screen. But yeah, symmetry really comes in handy with that. But it's interesting because when you think you're drawing a symmetrical piece on one side and you flip it, very often it's not. So you really have to pay attention to that. And symmetry in general in nature is there's a lot of it, and then there's also not a lot of perfect symmetry, and it's fascinating the way a lot of the stuff goes between. You can really go down a rabbit hole between looking at botany to looking at insects to looking at like macro images of like bacteria to just looking at a portrait of an animal. It's really fascinating, and if anybody is super interested in nerding out about that, I have some really great resources if you want to look into that some more.
Yeah, looking for the symmetry in nature is a way to really look for the beauty in nature. And no organism is perfectly symmetrical, but symmetry can work, I think, really well as a guideline to keep everything in proportion, which is something that I struggle with again when I'm trying to sketch out an animal. So we have, basic shape of Chunk's head. Maybe we can jump into more detail, Sarah.
Yeah, and the fun part now is connecting these pieces. And again, kind of shaping the mold, like I was saying before. So now is the fun part where I kind of just go in a little bit more and I'm moving things around. I'm seeing like what works here, what doesn't work here, what's starting to look a little off. And again, it's hard at this point in the game to really figure out exactly where everything is. You're going to be moving stuff around a lot of it. There was always so funny as a little anecdote. Like when I was in art school, my one of my professors just didn't even want me to erase, so I had to really get over the fact that I was just going to have to roll with a mistake.
Hmm.
We're not going to do that here. I'm not that strict, but it was helpful. It is a helpful thing to do. Maybe if you're on your own and just kind of work your way through a mistake, not erase it, and just see what comes out of it. It gives you more confidence to just be loose with it. So as you can see here, we're going back to connecting the shapes, kind of refining it a little bit. And here I am working on his snout, on his muzzle, which is always what will trip me up. And I end up going back and reworking that a little bit. And what I found is really helpful for me to kind of get the subtle lines in there is to start at like a really like a line that you can see very well. It's helpful on this particular one because his sound's very like prominent. You can really see where the lines are and really go through it like bit by bit and see how each part of the line or the shape moves because it's not a straight line. There's very subtle differences. You can even see here how I'm putting in the shape of his like lip line and all of that. All of that really adds to what makes a chunk, like what makes his expressions work and how he is operating. And it's, again, very subtle, but it's really helpful to just go in little by little and really focus in a very specific part to kind of bring those lines to where they need to be that really reflects what this image is doing. And it takes time. Sometimes, again, that's why I showed us just like an isolated part with like the eye earlier. Just drawing very specific parts of an animal or whatever you're working on over and over and over again really helps hone your observation skills to see these subtle changes here. So, I kind of put in my shapes here that I'm looking at. Again, I'm looking at where the highlights are too. So I'm blocking those off because that will really help me with kind of the shading and texture. I also put in his iconic scar, which is can actually be sometimes tricky because you can see it's over his entire snout there. So you have to make it kind of slowly go over the side of it. So it starts in one direction, kind of turns at the top, and then goes back down again. And when you're putting in characteristics like that, the reason why I'm very specific about the direction that it goes is that because it gives it dimension and it gives it life and a little bit more believability that this is Chunk, as opposed to just like a straight line across. But again, if we were to look at the picture behind me, you can see Chunk in the corner, maybe. And he just has kind of like a curved line on it, but it's a graphical choice that I took here there. This one, since we're doing something that's a little bit more in depth and detailed, I'm really trying to make sure that that scar that we all know very well is sticking out in a way that is recognizable and believable to Chunk. All right. So I went in again more, and I'm seeing where some of the really dark shapes are with his fur. As I was talking about with the eyes earlier, there's a lot of really interesting fur patterns around Bear's eyes. So I went in and kind of blocked that off a bit. So just to remind myself, like, hey, this is where a pattern change might be. This is where the fur might need to be in a certain direction. So just to kind of like remind myself so that if I'm just really sketching that I kind of blend that into where those areas are. And I'm looking for like the darker spots. And this was kind of a question, I think, too, that we had in our last episode about textures of fur, because it's really difficult. And it's awesome because I have seen some really great art in a lot of groups online from the bears of Brooks Falls. And some people do some amazing drawings that do very specific, almost, I would say, hair by hair pictures of these bears, and they're absolutely beautiful. We're not going to get too much into that today. I'm just kind of give you like a really brief overall, like how do we capture this and what would be considered essentially a field sketch, because it's a pretty quick one. And these are some of the easier ways to do it right now, is just to start looking at the colors of where these fur patterns are, because that will also indicate kind of the shape of the head itself. You know, sometimes if it's darker there, maybe there's a bone behind that, or maybe there's like another big roll of fur that's coming in that'll give it a little bit more depth, a little bit more dimension. And you can see I'm starting to do that a little bit more at the top there. At the top of this photo, he's got a lot of like highlights and rolls that like start to go back into his body a bit more. So to make it kind of look a little bit less of just a floating head out there, you know, I'll go back a little bit and kind of see like what are some of the added aspects of his face that I can put in here to kind of make this more of a whole picture. And it also helps me with references of where the rest of the face goes. So it may seem like, oh, I'm picking this little spot over this spot. It seems a little bit random. I'm doing these specific things to give me more reference points, to kind of bring it all together and bring it all home. And again, it takes time. You're just kind of like pushing the lines around a little bit. And I try and stay as loose as you can with it. Again, I tend to work a little bit darker. You don't always have to use like a dark pencil the way I am here. And again, when I'm doing this, I'm going to have to sharpen a lot because I am using a relatively softer lead, so that it kind of wears down pretty quickly with that. But again, with this, you're just kind of moving it very slightly, messing around where the lines are and taking your time. Don't get too wrapped up on the details here. Just kind of be loose with your hand. You don't have to press super hard here, and see where things are in reference to each other. Kind of going into eyes a little bit here. And this is, again, where it's important to have a really sharp edge to your pencil. This isn't a really big drawing. It's a small one. And to have a really fine point for the details, like the eyes, which I find are very important, is going to save you so much trouble in the long run, because you don't want to go back in and constantly erase and erase and erase, because then you're going to lose a lot of the spark that you need, because there'll just be kind of a residue on there. So getting those lines in very tightly in the beginning is pretty helpful for things like the eyes. How did the connection go for you on that one, Mike?
Yeah, it's getting there. I found that again, I misplaced where the eyes go. So, and you mentioned
Every
how
time,
that's
me
like
too.
a common thing. I was able to get a little bit more down, less lines, more kind of trying to capture, I guess, more feel for where shadows might be in the reference sketch, or at least portions of where darker fur is. Um, and then I was thinking about like what defines Chunk's face, and of course he has that that really recognizable scar. No other bear Brooks River has a scar across his muzzle like that right now. But that's only the kind of like one part of it. For me, also, one of the things that defines his face is currently is like a little bit of a pouty lower lip. And sometimes older bears get that. I don't know if I was able to really capture that
You did,
or
and I
or
know
not,
exactly what you mean.
but yeah, he has that too. I don't know if there's something else that you were looking at in his face. Like narrow set eyes, like that's another thing for me that he seems to have really narrow set
Yeah.
eyes, and then that pouty lower lip. What are you seeing that defines his face?
For me, it's always been his eyes, like his narrow set eyes. And now I'm never gonna not be able to see his lip now that you've said that. But yeah, aside from his scar, obviously, he's just got a really I mean, I guess expressive is the best way to say it, but like this spot to me on him has always been the thing that's like, oh yeah, that's Chunk. Definitely. Like you can see like his thought process like right here, I swear, even in the just most like subtle movements that he does. Oh, it's always been right there for me. Like, so yeah, that's again for me. It's the eyes that I think are what is the most prominent feature in most animals, but I think specifically in Chunk, like this whole area for me is like very him, definitely.
And these proportions are going to vary for other bears as well. Like if you were to think about, I don't know, Sarah, you could maybe talk briefly about maybe if you have experience drawing like a cub or
Oh
a
yeah,
subadult
no
bear.
different.
How did those proportions differ in like a younger bears? Because Chunk's a fully grown bear, huge skull, wide ears, and you're not going to see that in younger bears.
Yeah, it's very different. And there's actually kind of it's a pretty interesting role when you really start getting into learning about like the anatomy and biology and development and how that relates to art and nature drawing. It's actually very similar rules all across a lot of different species, this whole like cute factor that goes into like younger animals, younger creatures in general. And you have to be able to draw that very specifically. And a lot of that is like the like proportions. They have like bigger heads and like bigger eyes compared to the rest of their body, and a lot of that translates to almost every species that you can think of that are mammals, birds, lizards, reptiles, anything like that. I don't necessarily know about bacteria, but I don't know if we consider that cute. However, a lot of the basic anatomy features of younger creatures or animals have a lot of the same rules. So, the bigger eyes, the bigger heads, kind of the short, like stubby bodies, all that kind of comes into play. And then when we're looking at specifically like subadults, a lot lankier. They don't have like kind of
Yeah.
this big bulgy body. They look awkward. So your sketch is going to look awkward because they look awkward. I mean, we've all gone through that stage. But yeah, it's very different. And again, that is really helpful then in determining you can almost start to really gauge animals and bears' ages because you know their anatomy so well from drawing it so often. And again, this will really just help in general hone your observation skills and get to know these bears even better.
And as a reminder to our audience too, if you have questions for Sarah about sketching, need some tips, um, then drop those in the chats. We'll be looking for them during the rest of the program today. Sarah, I think we have one more video to talk about. This one's a time lapse version, like some of our other ones. But yeah, this one I think you wanted to take us through your process for adding those details of fur and texture.
Yep. This will kind of round out our sketch today. So this next video coming up, this is what it's going to end up looking like. But I had to speed this up again because it took me about 20 minutes, and I don't think you want to sit here and watch me do that. But yeah, I would go back in the beginning, and I erase the lines, and that really what brings the entire shape of Chunk together. So those guidelines and stuff that we're using, again, if there's still some there, you don't have to erase them. I do it at this point because I know where things are. I kind of moved it around. I spent that last time just like really putting stuff together. And this is where you can start to, get those lines out of the way and make the final shape kind of come to life, make it a little bit more realistic. So I started here by going with his snout, kind of just work from the bottom up. And I don't always just like work in one space. Like sometimes like, I'm tired of this one spot, I'm gonna go somewhere else. But I started here because it's usually the most challenging part for me personally, to get those highlights correct, to really make it look like it's not just a blob at the end of his nose there. And again, I'm really specifically looking for the really subtle highlights here. And sometimes you got to just zoom in really close and just look like almost pixel by pixel on a photo, because it's difficult for some of this stuff. And you don't always have to do this either. I mean, when I'm in the field and I'm drawing, sometimes it's just a scribble and I'm done. For something like this, where I kind of just wanted to dive in a little bit on the details and show you how I do it, that's where something like that is really helpful, to really see where the lights play off from each other. And we need to give it dimension. We need to make it a little bit less 2D, even though this is on a 2D surface. Like, how do we make this one part stand out a little bit more? Like, how do we know that Chunk's snout and muzzle and nose there is further away than the rest of his face? So it's perspective. And that's where our guide really came in handy in the beginning here, is that it gave us that perspective. So kind of like those lines that are leading out from the eyes to where the nose is, that's making our brain think that that nose is closer to us than the rest of his head there. And his muzzle, obviously, again, from looking at the reference photo, is a lot lighter. So I didn't spend too much time in the beginning here coloring that in or darkening it too much. I'm going to go back in later and do that, especially at the end when I'm doing some finishing touches here. But then I wanted to just kind of go back and start putting some more of the darker colors on Chunk's face itself. So again, I kind of have a little bit of like a scribble method. It's my style, the way I draw. Everyone's a little bit different. I also sometimes will go in and just do like long strokes of lines. And I am really following the fur pattern that is around the eyes first. That kind of gives me an idea of how all the fur is going to flow. And for the most part on bears' faces, the more and more you do these, they have a pattern to where their fur does flow. And in this one specifically, we can see where a lot of like the darker patches are. So I kind of start in those darker patches and then follow the lines basically, because they all branch out kind of right from the middle there and branch out to the side. And then the fur around his eyes kind of do a giant little circle there, like right around his eye, and then flush out a bit more towards the edge of his face. So that's where I spend a lot of my time looking at where things start to flow together. And it always looks a little bit weird at first because I'm not going in and putting in like the big highlights or the big contrast and stuff yet. I'm still just trying to figure out where everything is flowing in the first place and how that's going to connect to each other and how is this all going to even make sense at the end, because I know we all think about that. And again, I'm taking a lot of time doing this. I wouldn't necessarily do a portrait of this amount of detail, even though it's not super detailed. If I was actually in the field standing there, I'd probably do a really quick study, and then that's something I would bring back and rework on later, because this does take some time. It does take a lot of really tight observational skills to really see where the fur is going, and that's why it's helpful to, you don't always have to draw from life. You can take photos and take it back home and work on that too. There's nothing wrong with that. If anything, it just enhances your observational skill for the next time you're out in the field looking at things. So I'm coming back up into the beginning at the top of the head there and kind of putting a little bit more detail there. And that's what's kind of going to bring where the front of his face is to where everything starts to go back and fade away a bit more. So it's giving it a little bit more dimension. Again, kind of like trying to solve the puzzle of how do we make one part of the face look further ahead or further back than another part. And that's where a lot of the contrast comes into play, and the shading, and where I'm putting some of the shadows in. Starting to put in some of the shadows for the ears here. Ears are also really difficult, I think, sometimes. Again, they are something that is really important to identifying a bear. It's definitely one of the first qualities that I think a lot of us look for when we're looking at bears, even the color. And a lot of the color just has to depends on how like the light is shining on a bear at any given point. And so when you're looking closely at a bear's ear, it's really hard to see the details because it's just kind of like a furry blob. So you're really looking at where the highlights are. And so you can see I kind of left some white at the edge of the ears there to really bring forward where like the light was coming down and hitting it. And then I just go in afterwards and just really color in dark where these shadows are inside the ears. So you can tell that these ears are then pointed pretty far forward because of that. And again, a lot of this is just the constant observation and looking and the practice and all of that to really kind of bring it together. So I went in the back there and started really focusing a little bit more on his rolls to bring his neck back a little bit more. I went in just for fun and put in just where his like body was generally in the back. It's not something I finished in this one. It was just helping me visualize a bit more what his head looks like, because again, everything that you draw is in reference to another piece of the animal that you're doing. So it helps me with perspective, gives me a guideline. It's not something you necessarily have to do. I just like to do it sometimes. I'm like, okay, I'm on the right track. This is making sense, even though it looks a little weird, like from this perspective. But when you start putting like other pieces behind him, like his body, which is gigantic, you're like, okay, yeah, this is working. It's falling in place. I'm on the right track here. So after I kind of did all that and kind of put his basic colors in where where his ears are, where his nose is, I'm going in with my heavy graphite pencil that you can see here and really darkening up some of these areas. He's not dark enough for me. Yeah, anyway, he's got a really dark face there and we want to really bring that out. I think that really adds in his expression, and we just know of this is just what he looks like with his shadows in his face and this very specific expression that he has going on. So I'm really diving into just beyond where his muzzle is, so where his eyes are. It's very, very dark, but again, you don't want to just go in and like really go crazy with the graphite at first, piece by piece, because it'll be a lot easier to go in and make it darker than make it lighter again, because sometimes that a little bit of light is really what brings it into life a bit more. And you can cheat with this. Like if I've messed up and put like way too much ink, which I am working in right now, and there's not a whole lot of coming back if you're just using a bunch of ink. And I have messed this up in the past. You can always just go in with a little bit of a white paint or a little bit of white pencil if you really need to. It's the art police is not going to come for you to do that. And I've done this before too, so it's totally fine. There's again no rules to any of this. This is just practice. It's really helpful to go in the beginning and make sure that you have those whites and you keep them out, especially in the whites of the eye like we had talked about earlier. But you can rework that if you need to. This was a little fun thing at the very end here that I was doing, that I use a calligraphy pen, actually. It's for making Chinese calligraphy. They're really beautiful, really amazing pens. A lot of different stores have these specifically, and they're actually like a brush. And you can get ones that have ink inside of them. So, it's just like a fun thing that you can have that's not just this micron that I'm using. I'll go back and forth between using this micron, like super fine tip pen, to this Chinese calligraphy pen, which is beautiful. And they make brushes and stuff too that you can use with any ink. I use a lot of like India ink or calligraphy ink for that. And that will go in and really put in the last like really dark features in it. This is a stylistic choice for me. You don't always have to do this. I like to really work dark. I like to really have those big contrasts. I'm a Renoir fan, so he was really into that too. And it's just something I've developed over my many years of doing this. And you can see me kind of going in right there. It looks like a paintbrush, but it's all built in. And I'm just kind of doing a little bit of a wash over stuff and really bringing it out more of like the texture of the fur there, where some of the highlights are, and what's kind of just really rounding out chunk at the end. And again, you're looking at the picture, you're like, oh, wow, well, that one spot seems like it would be a lot darker than what you've portrayed there. And yeah, maybe some spots are, maybe some spots aren't. The real important part here is, are you enjoying what you're doing? Do you think it brought the point across of what you were looking at? What did you observe? And do you think that the highlights are accurately representing what you're doing? And it doesn't always matter. You can just be what you want it to be, and you can be happy with that. But that's just how I like to do it. I like to kind of have a lot more higher contrast when I draw. Not everyone needs to do that, but it's a stylistic choice. But how do you think about that, Mike? I know it was a really sped up one, but how is your texture going on that one?
Oh yeah, I'm done. I'm completely done. No,
Perfect.
I was concentrating mostly kind of on the forehead, I guess, as I thought
Mhm.
perhaps that would be easiest for me. I should have brought some more pencils over because I'm finding it wasn't dark enough. Like some of those spots that you were talking about that needed to be darker. Yeah, maybe I needed a different, I don't know, a different pencil. Maybe I needed to blend it. I lost my blender on the floor somewhere while we were talking, so I can't do that. And I was also missing, excuse me. I was also missing. Hang on a second.
I'll take a break too.
All right, maybe I had.
This is me all last week. I understand.
Yeah, I'm not.
Well, I'm sure it was a really good picture, Mike, because I really liked it. And again, too, like these, we're going through these really fast. Um, Take your time with this. It's not something that you're supposed to be doing in like 10 minutes to this level. Again, you can sketch anything you want in that amount of time. But these, we're using a lot of detail and stuff here, and we're kind of just playing around, being pretty loose with it. A lot of this is just showing you different techniques, and then you can go wild with it and do with it what you want. And that's why these videos are really great to kind of come back to you, because you can pause it, see where you're at on this, and kind of rework it again.
Okay, I think I'm back. I'm not sick or anything,
Great.
and I just listened to you
It
talk for
should be
10
me.
minutes. I'm resting my voice. Everything should be cool. I haven't eaten anything in an hour. That's a rule for me too before any public speaking. Don't eat within an hour so you don't have bits of food caught in your throat. But anyway, yeah, yeah, again, it seemed like I wanted things to be darker and I couldn't quite get them there. So again, I might need like a darker pencil or a softer pencil lead to blend more. I was also missing. I didn't bring a pencil sharpener over, and you that was one of the points that you mentioned. Keep a sharp point. So I was kind of missing my mechanical pencil. And this somebody I think last week asked for to see my favorite pencil. This is it. This is like a 25-year-old pencil.
That's
I
awesome.
take it everywhere for me, mostly for note taking. I couldn't use it for this though because this has a really hard lead in it. It's like 4H or something because I want it in my notebooks. I don't want those things to get smudged or smeared in the rain or something like that. So I use a really hard pencil lead for that. But yeah, yeah, I think using some of those, keeping a sharp pencil at this point would have helped me and a softer lead overall. But you know, I think it's great that you're emphasizing that we can make mistakes and we can erase. And then, you know, I guess one final question for me before we kind of get towards our conclusion. What other techniques could you use to maybe capture fur texture? Is there something else that, you know, maybe more blending or something that would help that with that?
Yeah, it varies. You don't have to actually do the very specific like lines. You can just like use the graphite itself and just blend it and just purely work with just the graphite itself. Like even charcoal is really nice for that. Using a hard pencil though, like the mechanical one that you had, is actually pretty good for stuff like this. If you didn't want to get too hung up. I'm like, again, you're seeing a lot of my style come through in this, but there's a lot of different ways to do this. With these mechanical pencils, you can actually get a variety of different leads too if you wanted to do darker stuff, but it really helps with the fine details. So I think in the previous episode, I kind of did a little demonstration of how to just do like swatches and stuff like that, and doing just like fine lines like that, very repetitively, very closely looking at where the patterns are. That's really helpful with this. It's also another pretty easy technique that I like to do if I'm doing like something fast, is that I will just go in and kind of just blend in really quickly and smudge like where the dark spots are and the highlights are. And then later I'll go back in with something like a pen or a mechanical pencil or something. And that's when I'll do the really fine detailed like slow lines. It can be sometimes monotonous. Sometimes people really like the flow, and I get into the flow of that too. So there's a few different ways to really tackle this sort of thing. This one was pretty messy and loose, but you can tighten it up a lot too. But it depends, and a lot of it is just getting comfortable with the tools that you're using. And there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just the one that you like the most.
Well, yeah, this has been fun. I think I think if I worked on this more, it would get to a point where people would be like, "Hey, that is chunk," in some in some respects at
Makes
least.
sense to me.
Yeah. Uh, and we have this isn't the last in our series though, Sarah. So as we wrap up our program today, we want to give us a bit of a preview for our next episode of Drawn to Explore, which is
Yeah.
Monday, August 12 at 12 p.m. Eastern.
Oh wait, today is the 12th, but we had to skip
Oh,
one.
right. That's right. I didn't change that. What anyway? 2 weeks. Add 2 weeks. The
The
26th.
25th.
Yes.
There we go.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I was like, oh, time warp.
All right.
Yeah, so next time we're gonna switch it up a bit. We're gonna do salmon. We're gonna add a little bit of color to this. And we're actually gonna kind of just dabble with a little bit of watercolor. Nothing too crazy. We're just gonna just kind of look at how colors work and interact with each other a bit. And especially by that time, I mean, I know already a lot of the salmon are starting to spawn, but they'll really start having a lot of that really pretty red. And we can really kind of take a lot of observations from what we're looking at. And they're one of my favorite things to draw because I find them to be so colorful and so anatomically interesting. So we're going to be doing a little bit of pen and ink and a little bit of watercolor. So spice it up a bit next week or in 2 weeks, rather.
Well, that sounds interesting and fun. And this has been fun. So Sarah, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Thanks for
Yeah. Thank
sharing
you.
your time and expertise.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. I'm so glad that I can be here and do this. It's really great drawing with you, Mike.
And my co-host today has been Sarah Woolman, a graphic design and social media curator for Explode.org. We encourage you to keep sketching and observing the world around you. And through our shared history, humanity has used art as a means of connecting with and better understanding nature. So we are taking a journey that people have done for thousands and thousands of years. And as with all of our live events, a replay of this live chat will be available on Explode.org's YouTube channels. And see you next time, everybody. And of course, as we like to say, on Explode.org, never stop learning.